All right, welcome everyone to the Center for Studies in Religion and Society's summer lecture series. My name is Kathy Chan, and I am the acting director of the CSRS for the 2022-23 academic year. I'd like to open this lecture on this beautiful day by acknowledging and respecting the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory we are holding this lecture series, and the Songhees, the Esquimalt and Wasatch peoples who have continuing historical relationships with these beautiful lands. I'm very pleased to introduce our lecturer today, Dr. Nicola Hayward. Dr. Hayward is an adjunct lecturer at the Vancouver School of Theology and a valued associate fellow with a fairly long history at the CSRS. Dr. Hayward's work and research focuses on women and gender in antiquity. And I look forward to hearing her insights today on the Mosaic program in Ravenna during the late antique period and what it tells us about female participation in ritualized space. So welcome to Nicola. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Kathy. Thank you very much for having me here. So today I'm going to talk about the Sant'Apollinare Nuovo and its mosaics in Ravenna. So this project initially came about for a call for papers on women in sacred space. So what you're getting today will be a draft version of that paper that will eventually be published in October of this year out of Germany, Brussels in Germany. It's by the work of Dr. Lillian Denise, who is sort of the brain behind this series. So, and she's gathering numerous papers. In fact, it initially began this project as a single volume, and she's had so much interest in it, it's now actually gone to a 2-volume series on women and sacred space in antiquity. So my choice specifically for this project delves more into my interest in women and gender, as well as my love for art and art history. So I'm trying to mix all those three together. This, for those of you who are not familiar with Ravenna, I think I've got it. There we go. This is the external view of the Sant'Apollinare Nuovo Ravenna in Ravenna in Italy. For those of you who are unfamiliar sort of where Ravenna is, it lies up in the top part of the boot. I've circled it for you, so it's easy to see. It's right on the edge of the Adriatic Sea there. It's a very interesting city in that it's gone through quite a few changes. During this period, it was actually the administrative seat of the Roman Empire, which meant it brought in a lot of prestige, a lot of building projects, and a great deal of activity at that time. Under King Theodoric, who was the ruler at that time, he was king, he was not emperor. Under King Theodoric at that time, Ravenna thrived as both an intellectual center, producing poems, philosophical treatises, medical, historical, and geographical writings as well. Ravenna probably, in all honesty, is probably best known for its mosaics though. And it's got stunning, gorgeous mosaics, whether it's in the Sant'Apollinare Nuovo or in San Vitale and so forth. The mosaics are absolutely gorgeous. This particular basilica was built from the ground up by King Theodoric in the early 6th century. King Theodoric was actually an Arian. He was raised in Constantinople, more of a sort of prisoner of war, so to speak. He was given to Constantinople so that his father would behave. He's an Ostrogoth by origin, Germanic tribes. So he was sort of there to kind of keep his father in line. As a result of that, he was brought up in the court in Constantinople. So he's got quite a few, even though he was an Arian, he has a lot of influence or a lot of training also in the Orthodox tradition as well. In 560, Justinian I came in, retook over the area, and then rededicated this basilica to St. Martin to begin with, who we'll see in these images. He was not a martyr, but he's still depicted there. And St. Martin was actually a defender of the Orthodox tradition. So they had him up at the very front top there of that procession. The this is the dimension at the time of the Sant'Apollinare Nuovo. So the main apse is 35 meters long, the main apse. It is 21 meters wide, so it's actually quite a wide basilica in that respect. And each aisle is half that of the nave's width as well. The height of the basilica is extremely high, much taller than it is wide, which gives it that sort of voluminous feel to it as well. You enter the basilica from the west side, entering towards the east. So you'll see here, this sort of gives you a bit of a sense of the scale and the light of this particular basilica. It's got 9 windows along the aisle side to allow for light to fall in. Now, of course, today, only the windows that you see on this side, which is the north wall, they are the, south wall. They are the only ones that exist. The north wall no longer exists. In fact, it's got, the windows are removed and it's actually now got about 7 rooms in that area. Above, there is another 11 windows above those existing 9 windows, again, to allow for natural light to fall into that space. The one thing, now this church, like many churches, it's gone through earthquakes, it's gone through wars, it's gone through theological debates and so forth. The one thing that is still the original within this particular space is the mosaics at the top. The very, let's see if I can use this pointer, right at the top area up here, right, is actually where the original mosaics still exist. The other ones have changed significantly over time, particularly because Theodoric was an Arian. When Justinian took over, he changed the program quite a bit to fit the more Orthodox tradition. But he left the top registra and those images up there. The mosaics themselves, when we go through them, this sort of gives you another sense of the light. When you go through the church, this basilica, you actually have a procession. So you begin this here, when you see it, this is entering from this side over here. When you walk in, you have 22 female martyrs processing in this direction. And they actually do, if you look closely, you can actually see the movement of their feet walking in that procession, in that direction. You will then come to the end where you have the 3 magi from the nativity scene. They were initially depicted with crowns. Later on, for some reason, they actually had the Phrygian caps put on them instead. Right? And then you end up here with Mary enthroned with baby Jesus. Of course, this is after the Council of Chalcedon. Therefore, she's known now as the Theotokos, or the Mother of God. The next frieze up here has a series of, whether it's apostles or whether it's prophets, whatever the case may be, it's male figures. They either hold scrolls or they're holding books. And then above that, we have 13 scenes from the narrative, the life and times of Jesus, miracles, healings, and as well as the passion narrative. This is a list of all of them. There's actually 26 in total, so 13 on the north side and 13 on the south side. This is the list of them. I'm not going to, for time reasons, I'm not going to go through all of them. I've highlighted the ones in red, which are the ones that I will actually specifically be looking at. So it will be the parable of the widow's mite, the Samaritan woman, and the hemorrhaging woman, or the Canaanite woman, depending on how you read that particular fresco. And then on the south wall is the 2 Marys at the empty tomb. Punctuating each of these narrative scenes is a cupola shell with ribbons and doves and a cross at the top. Each one of them is punctuated by this theme. The south wall here has, again, the south wall here has, again, starting from this side here, which is the Palace of Theodore. And it actually has been changed somewhat, because if you can't, I don't know if you can see it here, but on these pillars, there's actually hands, most likely potentially maybe members of his court, that have actually now been removed. But you start with his palace, and then you walk your way through the martyrs here, 25 martyrs, ending up with Saint Martin up here, and then the enthroned Jesus, a bearded Jesus with 4 angels. This dimension here, for the first 2 registers are roughly about 3 meters tall, so each of them. So they're fairly substantial. The top meter up at the top register up here, they register roughly about, say, 3.5 feet by 4 feet, so significantly smaller. And of course, one of the issues that I'm having here when we're looking at viewer participation is, of course, the viewing of these. I mean, when you're looking down up at them, it's roughly about 40 feet above the viewer's head that these top mosaics up here would be situated. And as I said earlier, it's these mosaics up here that are the original ones still from the time of Theodoric in the early 6th century. My primary interest, like I said, is interested solely at this point in the widow's mite, the Samaritan woman, the Hemedrine woman, or the Canaanite woman, and the women at the empty tomb. Before I discuss these works, however, I'd like to discuss a little bit about the importance of images themselves. In a recent article, Christopher Nydren argues for a new mode of inquiry when discussing visual rhetoric. In particular, he is concerned with the flexibility of the term image when applied to biblical illustration, since it is a term with varied meaning and may be understood as being textual, mental, or material. Rather, Nygren suggests a more precise use of a term, one that is specific and concrete to material objects. He suggests the term graphic exegesis be utilized when dealing specifically with pictures, a term that is more precise and distinct from visual or imagine-based exegesis at the heart of retrographic interpretation of the Bible or from other historical engagements with the biblical exegesis. Nygren, according to Nygren, graphic exegesis presupposes there's a category of biblical pictures that offer their own exegesis of biblical narrative and do not simply illustrate the text. And this has sort of been an ongoing issue where images tend to support text rather than the other way around. So they're always a little bit subservient to the textual account rather than proffering their own biblical exegesis of that account. So he's trying to switch that up so that images themselves may be functioning as the primary source and not subservient to the text. This is not to suggest that all biblical pictures ought to be considered for biblical exegesis, such as certain sculptures or stained glass, but pictures that interpret the biblical narrative through pictorial means. To put it another way, certain pictures of biblical narratives do not simply render biblical exegesis in concrete visual form already found elsewhere in textual form, but rather do the work of biblical interpretation and theological argumentation themselves. Rather than interpret the biblical narrative through discursive language, then, graphic exegesis allows the viewer to engage with the biblical narrative through pictures. Applied to the Mosaic program in Sant'Apollinare Nuovo Basilica, graphic exegesis is a useful way to think of these artworks and depict female encounters with Jesus that proffer their own biblical exegesis. Viewing from the left, so when you enter into this basilica, you enter from the west and move towards the east. Looking here, this is the east. And this will be the first, if you're looking to the left, when you enter into the basilica, you'll see the port of Santa Clase on the left as you enter in. The first picture that you come to, which is situated in the very top, is the widow's mite. Okay? So upon entering viewing from left to right, the widow's mite is the first mosaic from the Gospels a female viewer would encounter upon entering the basilica. Please do bear in mind there's still this issue of viewing because they are up extremely high. So there will be that issue of viewing. Situated on the left-hand side of the south part of the nave. The image is relatively small. It's 3.7 meters or feet roughly by 4.5 feet. So it's still not exactly tiny. It's still got a fair size to it. And is positioned 12 meters above the viewer's head. Both accounts in Mark and Luke place the widow in the temple. The image of the Sant'Apollinare Nuovo, however, places the narrative in a grassy field with rolling hills. On the viewer's left, the widow puts her 2 coins into the temple treasury, while Jesus and his disciples gaze at her from the opposite side. Her head and body are modestly covered. Important for viewer participation in this, which is quite different from the narrative, is that the widow's gaze, which directly confronts the viewer. As accenting this dialogical relationship are her feet, which also positioned towards the viewer, emphasizing her engagement with them. The textual account of the widow renders her flat, actually, and speechless. And like many biblical women, she also remains nameless. By focusing the widow's gaze on the worshiper, the artist has created a dialogical relationship between the visual narrative and the viewer. As Liz James has noted, seeing pictures creates a sense of presence. They offer grace, comfort, and delight when looked upon. Next, and this sort of gives you a scale of understanding of what you're looking at when you're viewing this particular image. And again, the images would be up in this registrar right up here, and much further back though. The next image is the Samaritan woman. Unlike the widow's mite, the image of the Samaritan woman does adhere somewhat to the biblical narrative and depicts the account in an open grassy area with rolling hills. The frame is equally divided between the woman and Jesus, making them equally the center of inquiry. A young beardless Jesus sits on a rock and raises his right hand in the gesture of speaking as he gazes at the woman. He is dressed in a purple pallium, and a decorated halo. And this disciple behind him, who looks more like he's kind of like squeezed in as an afterthought, is also dressed in a white pallium. Both figures wear traditional Roman sandals. The woman stands on the viewer's left, with the well situated between her and Jesus. Like the widow's mite, her head is modestly covered. But more importantly here, she is wearing contemporary dress from middle class women of the 6th century. Depicting the Samaritan woman in contemporary dress serves to render visible the collapse of historical time with that of the present viewer, bringing the past up to the present and making the narrative relative to the viewers. This collapse not only allows contemporary viewers to identify with the characters, but also challenges the viewers to understand the Christian message. Gazing directly at Jesus, she uses both of her hands to pull the bucket of overflowing water. Other depictions often don't have her using both her hands, but actually they articulate more this aspect of dialogical speech or her talk with Jesus. So here, this is a much earlier one. This comes from roughly about 350 CE from the Via Latina catacomb in Rome. And you'll see in this rendering of the same account, there's still the well situated, but the woman's hands are clearly in a position of speech, which is accenting that idea of dialogical relationship between her and Jesus. But gazing directly at Jesus, she uses both of her hands to pull the overflowing bucket of water. Since the water jug is presumably empty in the textual narrative, because the textual narrative doesn't depict anything about the actual water. In fact, when you read the textual narrative, it's more as if the water bucket, her jug, was actually never filled at all, that she never actually got to that activity before she fled to go back to the townspeople. Here, the artist has decided to actually fill the bucket full so that she's needing to use both of her hands to actually pull the jug up. The artist perhaps wanted to emphasize the idea here of flowing water, central aspect of the dialogue between Jesus and the Samaritan woman. Directly next to the Samaritan woman is the mosaic of the hemorrhaging woman. Or some people might consider her the Canaanite woman. It's hard to tell. People are undecided whether this is the hemorrhaging woman or the Canaanite woman. Scholars are undecided. Since Matthew does not mention the hemorrhaging woman kneeling, it is perhaps appropriate to read her as a Canaanite woman, as both accounts, Matthew and Mark, depict her prostrating before Jesus. Or perhaps it could serve to depict both narratives on viewer interpretation. Depends on perhaps how you read it, or perhaps maybe how the liturgy is running at that time. The woman is positioned to the right of the frame with outstretched arms as she prostrates herself before Jesus and his disciple. Her body is completely covered in a cloak and her face is exposed. Behind the woman, the crowd looks on. Although there's one figure, interestingly, he looks off to the side and looks a little bit bored and sort of uninterested in this particular scene. Jesus, depicted on the viewer's left, takes a step towards the woman with his right hand outstretched in a gesture of speech. As with the previous two images, he is beardless and dressed in purple with a halo over his head. His disciple, who follows closely behind, is dressed in white and gestures towards Jesus, perhaps emphasizing his healing abilities. The last image that I'm particularly interested in, actually, I'll go back to this sort of slide here. This sort of accounts, it's hard to know because deciding whether or not it's the Samaritan woman, or sorry, the Canaanite woman or the hemorrhaging woman is a bit problematic. This here, the image here on the left, is also an early catacomb image from Marcellinus and Peter, has an image of this hemorrhaging woman kneeling down and grabbing the cloak of Jesus. So it's clearly from that narrative. Another account slightly later has, again, the Canaanite woman, but here quite often she's often positioned as if speaking to Jesus and pleading with Jesus. This previous one here doesn't have that. So scholars are really torn between whether or not it is the hemorrhaging woman or the Canaanite woman. And perhaps it doesn't really even matter. Perhaps it's up to the viewer and what they see in it, in that situation. Directly next to the Samaritan woman is a mosaic of the hemorrhaging woman and the Canaanite woman. Oh, sorry, we're on the last one. The last image, we come to is here. The last image is depicted from the biblical narrative as the woman of the empty tomb on the south side near the entrance. So again, when you walk into the basilica, this particular image will be situated on the right, up high. According to Dreskin Whelan, the mosaic references Mark 16, 1-8. I suggest that the image is best read in the light of the Matthean account, however. My reason for this preference lies in the depiction of the two women in this mosaic and not three, as both Mark and Luke narrate, or Mary Magdalene, as John narrates. Moreover, the Matthean account narrates one angel, narrates one angel, as does Mark, rather than two men in Luke and John. That is, the Matthean account ticks more boxes than the Markan does, or Lucan or Johannine accounts. The tomb, with an empty sarcophagus in the center, a particularly expensive type of burial, dominates the scene. The smiling angel is depicted on the viewer's left, sitting on the grassy knoll as he gestures with his right hand towards the two women. In his left hand, he holds a scepter. His figure is prominent since he is seated and still happens to be the same height as the standing women. The two women, wrapped in robes, gesture towards the tomb with their right hand. They wear the same head covering as the widow's mite and the hemorrhaging or Canaanite woman. Dreskin Whelan has noted, interestingly, that the woman in the front wears a purple dress and a gold stripe, the same as worn by Mary and Jesus. And she suggests perhaps that this maybe is Mary, contrary to the gospel narratives. Women in faith in late antiquity. There's nothing new in the realization that women's history is fraught with historical problems. This is also the case with women's history in the 6th century or the early Byzantine period, specifically with non-elite lay women. Nonetheless, this is the demographic that I'm trying to engage with in this paper. I wish to, this period where early Byzantine overlapped with the Roman Empire and where Justinian's empire included not only the Mediterranean, North Africa, South Spain, and more importantly for this paper, the Italian peninsula, which included the city of Ravenna. Prior to the Eastern Justinian's reign, King Theodoric ruled from 349 to 526. He was a pro-Arian and an Ostrogoth and spent most of his childhood, as I said, in Constantinople. As a result of both his overlap and Justinian's, I do place this basilica in the early Byzantine period, because there's always this distinction: is it the Latin West or is it the East? And this particular period, you can say that Ravenna would be considered under the Byzantine Empire. Prior to the 8th century, it is difficult to be precise regarding the Byzantine liturgy. In fact, as Robert Taft points out, the Byzantine liturgical system was actually a hybrid system of both Constantinopolitan and Palestinian rites. People took an active role in the fourth century processions, however, of the liturgy, which consisted of processions accompanying the entrance of the clergy, the readings of sacred scripture, the offertory bread of wine, and the communion. These rites, which both lay and men and women participated in, were poetically rich and enacted within the ritual setting of the Byzantine architecture, the church decoration, the incense, the creating a theatrical space where congregants met to meet God, where the church becomes the heaven on earth, where God in heaven dwells and moves. women initially had a much greater role. Now, trying to find the exact role of what was going on, I'm going to skip through this part just due to time. There were deacons, there were widows, there was office of widows, which did eventually fade out. There is deacons, which did have a strong role within the church. They were responsible for teaching, for baptism, although they were not actually allowed to say the ritual rites of the baptism, but they were there allowed to immerse the women. The Didascalia states this more as an overview of what women must do for other women, because men cannot be participating in some of these ritual activities. Therefore, women were necessary in that respect. But women were quite prominent. They did, over time, become more restricted as the church moved from a house church into a more public setting church. Their roles were certainly more restricted at that time, but they still did have a prominent role within the liturgical system. But I'm going to sort of skip through that part. So you can ask any questions afterwards, but just due to time, I'm going to move on now to the framing of the pictures. It is well known that Byzantine Christian icons functions as a focus for the viewer to contemplate the divine, as a source of meditation. As Margaret Jensen points out, the icon was intended to mediate the prayers and reverence of the faithful, effectively transmitting them from the image to its prototype. Jensen notes, however, that early Christian art is rarely, if ever, viewed in a similar manner as Byzantine icons. And she speculates whether early Christian art may have generated a subjective epiphanic experience as well for early Christians. Moving a little later to the late antique period, Liz James, in a recent online art lecture at Harvard University, also asked a similar question of mosaics. Did they, mosaics, function as a similar theological way to that of icons, or were they merely decorative wallpaper? Building on both Jensen and James's questions, I would like to narrow the conversation more specifically and ask, how did mosaics that featured gospel narratives with female characters function as a subjective epiphanic experience for female viewers in a public church setting in the 6th century? The mosaics of Sant'Apollinare Nuovo were certainly purposefully placed along the nave and nave walls. For example, the last mosaic, which goes here for the last mosaic, is situated right next to the apse, depicts the Eucharistic scene. It is, of course, positioned where the Eucharistic ritual happens. By placing the mosaic next to the apse, worshipers were encouraged to remember and relive the story of the Last Supper. Indeed, the artist has deliberately squished the apostles, and you can see here this particular individual. He's just sort of squished, trying to get in through, sort of peek into the table there and try to find his space. So the placing of the mosaic in the apse, worshipers encouraged to remember and relive the story of the Last Supper. Indeed, the artist has deliberately squished the apostles into the scene so that the space may open for the viewers to imagine themselves dining with Jesus. The lower level mosaic, which were much larger, also functioned in a similar visual way, urging worshipers to enter. Framing the immediate interior space on the south wall entrance, and we're looking here for the south wall, working over in this area here, is the Port of Classe on the north wall in its Theodoric's palace. Worshippers visually pass through each building and are immediately led through the space by the procession of the female martyrs towards either the enthroned Mary or the enthroned Jesus. Although it is difficult to discern the reason regarding the ordering of the narrative scenes of the Gospels, perhaps they were arranged in sequence for the church calendar, their presence in the space is certainly purposeful and meant to engage worshipers. Narrated gospel stories function differently than pictorial counterparts. When read aloud, the story is shaped within the time frame of the telling. It is the aim of the storyteller to perform the text, to convey the emotions of each character, and to establish a setting. A performer was free to improvise and put his or her take on the narrative, adjusting to the audience and their responses during the performance. Besides tones, gestures, architectural space would also have determined how a text was performed. Visual gospel narratives function in a slightly different manner. Firstly, and possibly the most obvious, is there a lack of narrator unless the viewer imagines the author of the text. Secondly, venerated mosaics are placed up high above the viewer's head. And thirdly, in our case, wall mosaic pictures, in case our case, wall mosaics, are fixed in a position that has the added advantage of permitting the viewer to languish over its content and to contemplate its message. proceeding at their own pace. In essence, the viewer becomes their own narrator and biblical exegete of the visual text. When a text is read aloud, the listener is engulfed in the world of the story, often present in the mind's eye. But when viewing images, the real world is always present in the architecture, the light, the physical space that houses the images, and the images themselves. Indeed, one of the difficult tasks of the artist was to create a visual narrative from the outside and make it intelligible to the viewer. Richard Brilliant notes the visual narratives that visual narratives have three narrators: the artist, the protagonist, and the viewer. The artist would have a particular visual rhetoric of natural imagery that helped expand the narrative so that the viewer would have recognized the account as well as expanded upon it to take notice of its details. Visual descriptive details and compositional devices such as landscapes, wells, dress, or figural gestures, which replace the elements of speech, help to identify the protagonist and the actions in time and space and must be recognizable. According to Brilliant, then, visual narratives seem to invoke an atmosphere of illusion or fact, realistic if not historical in character, since they are in some ways part of the real world. It is paramount that the artist provides enough visual clues so that the story is successfully depicted and recognizable to the viewer, whether they are drawing on real or imagined information. Visual narratives do have their own syntax or way of conveying the story, in part because they appear whole, but also because of their abundant descriptive content that has been deliberately selected by the artist from reality and therefore has its own coding or decoding requirements. Brilliant notes that while literary narratives have the ability to set the plot and answer the how or where of actions, visual narratives in abbreviated format, it becomes an extra linguist referent. Thus, while descriptive details in visual images do realize the action and actors, it more relates closely to the passages of narrative time, to the preformation of everyday experience. Visual images, therefore, may be more limited in disclosing actions of how and where than literary text and require a greater thought process from the viewer and than the artist. Thus, answers to why must come from the visual material, the close-up description of the persons and events, as well as viewers' own prior experience. Other ways for female viewers to engage with and understand the mosaics through viewer identification with the characters. The female characters depicted in these mosaics are all unnamed women, except for the women at the tomb, who are described as Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome from Mark 16. David Beck is interested in reader identification with named and unnamed characters in textual narratives, but his argument is equally applicable to visual narratives. Beck maintains that from a reader's perspective, the anonymity of the unnamed woman in the narrative enables the reader to identify with the characters, allowing them to insert themselves into the narrative. The lack of a name provides a gap which the reader may fill with his or hers or with her own identity, investing herself into the narrative and allowing herself to confront the circumstances and situation of the character in the text. It is not only unnamed characters that cultivate a connection with the viewer, but their adornment of clothing as well, which I noted with the mosaic of the Samaritan woman, as she was dressed in contemporary clothing, enabled the viewer to identify with the character, perhaps imagining themselves as witnesses to these accounts or imagining themselves in similar situations. After all, the mosaic of the Last Supper, depicted at the front of the church, purposefully leaves a space open for viewers to also celebrate the Eucharist with Jesus and his disciples. Images provided a viable way to educate the faithful, whether they're literate or illiterate. Fighting against iconoclasm, Pope Gregory advocated for the importance of images in the guiding faithful. Quote, "For what writing presents to readers, this, a picture, presents to the unlearned and who behold, since even the ignorant see what they ought to follow. In it, the illiterate read. Hence, chiefly to the nations, a picture is instead of a reading." It is not simply the image itself, however, that cultivated a religio-aesthetic environment for the worshiper. The sacred space that housed these mosaics also provided a hallowed environment, creating a dialogical relationship between the mosaic, the viewer, and the divine. The performance begins when one leaves the profane space of the streets and the market, crossing the threshold into the sacred space. Today, this is often marked with the dipping of fingers in holy water, making the sign of the cross. Sharon Gertzkel notes that Byzantine people understood the interior of the church as a transtemporal or transspatial, a deliberate confusion of time and space where the past met the present. The manipulation of space is amplified by the use of color and light and smell and architectural components. Upon entering the Basilica of Sant'Apollinare Nuovo, congregants would cross the entrance and immediately be immersed in the smell of burning incense and candles. The interior of the Sant'Apollinare is designed to create a sense of space by the heightened, the ceiling, which is much taller than the actual space itself, or the nave. This sense of space is amplified by the lighting, which pours in through the windows. You get right here, so you get this sort of sense of light as it pours in through the windows of the celestial walls, as well as through the large windows in the nave. As the light radiates around the basilica, the mosaics shimmer and shine and dance on the wall, creating a theater of spectacle, dazzling the spectators with the polychromaticity. Liz James writes about the importance of understanding color symbolism and light and their role in the conveying of the divine. Unlike today, where form is dictated by lines and shading, in late antiquity, it is color that gives form meaning, making it possible for the viewer to understand. Gregory of Nyssa, writing in the 4th century, notes, quote, "If we contemplate a painting and try to understand it, at first it is simply a material surface, which by way of different patches of color helps to fulfill the portrayal of the living reality. Yet when the beholder of the painting observes is what color technique itself helps to fulfill. He does not confine himself to admiring colored masses on surface. His perception moves towards the form which the artist has revealed by way of colors." For Gregory, form and reality are manifested through color, a belief, James notes, that persisted into the Byzantine period. It is through color that objects receive their divine truth, for even God, according to Gregory, painted man with various colors in his own image. Since color gives form meaning, rendering the image authentic, according to the patriarch Nicephorus, it is one of the most important mediums for creating a realized, truthful reality. Equally significant to the role of color is preserving reality is a role of sensory perception, which Gregory notes was carried out by the viewer, aiding them in understanding the divine meaning. According to James, Gregory attributed a greater role to the interpretation of colors and words to fulfill the reality of the object. This sensory perception, of course, is sight. Images had the profound effect on the viewer of functioning as a visual revelation of the divine. Seeing God manifest in human form was essential for Athanasius, who notes that it's important that God take on human form, not only so that he may teach and heal, but so that he might be perceived and understood. He continues to state that men naturally know the Father more quickly by means of a body than similar to their own than by divine work and by divine works. Robin Jensen rightly observes Athanasius' treatise on incarnation that seeing is salvific. That is, it's not simply a matter of the mind to know God, but that seeing God in the flesh is the beginning of the reformation of the whole person. The act of looking or seeing is also important in the Gospel of John. And of course, the Samaritan woman is from the Gospel of John. In fact, viewing may be understood as being salvific in this text. The act of looking is emphasized when Philip asked Jesus to show him the Father. Jesus replies, "Anyone who's seen me has seen the Father." Wonder stories in the Gospel of John also stress Jesus' identity. And while Jesus rebukes those who visually require a sign, it is still important for understanding who he is. The act of looking would not have been lost on the female Byzantine viewer as they gazed up at these mosaics. Indeed, during the 8th century, the iconoclasts, in order to defend their stance against icons, employed Ambrose's statements that hearing was actually more important than seeing. Basilicas were dedicated for a purpose of being gazed upon, with their color, their brilliance, their sheen, and depiction of the divine, which conveys the heavenly world beyond. The Sant'Apollinare Nuovo is no exception to this, as its walls are set against a gold background and richly decorated with colored tessera of purple, blue, red, and green. Indeed, it is no accident that gold is one of the first colors the viewer sees, since gold conveys the heavenly light, and elevates the human figures to the realm of the heavenly world above. Byzantines were well aware of the significance of the interior of the church as a microcosm of the world, where the worshiper momentarily entered heaven through penitence and prayer. With their heads bowed and the words of the liturgy evoked, the past and the present, the sacred and the profane were blurred. Churches were naturally dimmer places, softly lit by light as well as candles. The heightened sense of the sacred space, the rhythmic chanting of prayer, and the visual display of color mosaics urged the female worshippers to enter the alternative world of the gospel narratives. The gospel narratives emanating from these pictures of the gospel narratives emanating these pictorial stories of women was enhanced through the colors and lights, which revealed the truth of their actions and gave them meaning. In this environment, the early Byzantine women would have heard the liturgy and encountered the gospel women portrayed on the nave walls as she moved through the church, the Samaritan woman, the hemorrhaging woman or Canaanite woman, the widow's mite, and the women at the tomb. These accounts would have been familiar to the women, and perhaps some of them had their favorites. Since men and women were separated during the church service, with women on the north side of the nave and men on the south side, women would have experienced these scenes together, viewing these accounts as a cohesive group with a shared gender identity, perhaps may have led them to a greater devotion, to a greater expression of female religiosity.
Thank you. That was really interesting. And did you take those pictures?
No. I have not been to Ravenna as of
you've
yet.
Not yet.
Not
been
yet.
to Ravenna.
Not yet.
Okay.
It is next year, hopefully.
Okay.
Mhm.
So we've got a little bit of time for questions. I have an initial one, and then people can put up their hand, or if there are people online who have questions. I was just wondering if you could put this into a little bit of context for us in terms of the churches being built in that era and in that region. So is what's going on in this basilica in terms of the number of female figures unique, or is this something that's quite common during this period?
From what I've seen, and I still got more basilicas, I actually have to look with that. From what I've seen so far, and I've looked at the Sant'Apollinare, it seems more unique that there's more biblical female characters in this particular basilica. I could be wrong, but it seems this is one of this particular basilica is one of the unique ones that it's got all these narrative scenes from the gospel account, with 4 of them featuring women. And it's one of the earliest historical accounts where it has that series of narrative accounts from the biblical text.
And I was thinking, I've been spending too much time with lived religion people, obviously. But I was kind of trying to imagine, right, the experience of going into this space, and certainly you conveyed really well, like the light and the smells and the kind of feeling of being in there. But I'm still a little bit pondering the height that you brought to our attention a few times, and how well are they actually going to be, like, can they gaze upon this and really see what's going on, or is it really too far?
Well, there's still 3, the images themselves are basically 3.5 by 4.5 on average. Some are a little smaller, some are a little bigger, but 3.5 by 4.5 feet. So they're not tiny. Yeah. They're not tiny. Now, the women would be positioned off to the south side and the men off to the south side and the women off to the north side. They would not have been able to view those mosaics from that position because they would be directly underneath them. They would have positioned those as they were walking down the nave. So maybe as they're going towards to receive the Eucharist, they would have been able to perceive them, or as they're initially entering the basilica, they would have been able to perceive them. But they would have purposefully had to have done that action. It's not like it was in your face. You would have to have stepped aside and looked up. Yeah, so it would have had to have been a deliberate action.
And did people, and I'm going to really show my ignorance here for this period, but did people sit?
They did sit, yes.
Okay.
You could sit, yeah, definitely. They don't have, this is all bare now.
Right.
But yes, seating during worship was part of, yeah. Okay. I mean, you could stand as well, but yes, there was seating in the early Byzantine church.
Yeah.
Seating in the early church.
Right. Other questions, thoughts? Oh.
Hi, I've been in the church, and it's very difficult to see these mosaics at the top. And think about it in the 6th century, because there was originally another register. They would even have been higher.
Yes, they would have.
So really, I'm not even sure that any woman coming into the church would have known that there were women up there.
Yeah.
It's so difficult
And
to
that-
identify anything in the top. And I mean, I'm also wondering, these were ones that were put up in the time of Theodoric, and this was, you know, his palace church. And it's almost sort of similar to Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome,
Yes.
where it's really difficult to identify the images when you're on the ground floor of the church. So I think it was Hitzinger or somebody who said that these are more like a kind of symbolic narrative. What was important is that they were there more than anything else, because, you know, I have to say the ones at the top there, really, you've got to know what the scenes are before you go into the church, before you can actually identify them.
And they might, and that's sort of the problem that I'm having right now, is the height.
Yeah.
The visual
Yeah.
representation up being up that high. And perhaps maybe that was all they required, was knowing that they were there. Maybe
It
they
was more
couldn't
like-
see the detail.
It's
but
more like it was important that they were there. And
Yes.
people knew they were there, but
Perhaps.
I
Yeah.
think the relationship between those
Mm.
top level mosaics and the viewer,
Yeah.
for me anyway, is probably quite minimal.
It might have been. It's hard to say, sort of getting into the minds of women in that
Yeah.
period. But I mean, it's not, when the images were put up, they were put up purposefully. Like there were
Yeah, oh,
reasons
sure.
for them being there. Otherwise, why put them there?
Yeah.
So they were done there for a reason. Whether, I mean, some women might have been able to see them more easily than other women. Perhaps just knowing that they were there helped in sort of a more ritualized environment to help further them forward in their own religious experience.
I mean, part of what's interesting, just to jump in on that, is that the image in particular where the woman is staring straight out at the viewer. I mean, so you may not be able to perceive that, right, very well if you're standing on the ground, but at the same time, as you say, there's this piece of the artist's role, right, in the relationship as well. And clearly someone is thinking through this relationship with the viewer.
And having picture, because really, when you read the widow's mite in the biblical text, she really is just, she's there putting 2 coins, and she's used more as a prop for Jesus to explain this as, you know, how faith happens. But this artist specifically turned her vision so that it does engage the viewer, even if it's up high. It's there meant to look out at petitioners, as well as her feet are positioned in that same stance. Which the biblical narrative simply doesn't have. That was an artistic choice on behalf of the artist to do that. Same thing with putting the, I think it was the Samaritan woman in the dress of contemporary, you know, 6th century Byzantine women. We could have put it in any dress, but he specifically chose that one. Again, that helps with identifying, whether they could see it or not, even knowing, you know, would have helped.
Thank you. Question.
I guess along that line, and forgive my ignorance here, but I'm assuming, perhaps again ignorantly, that a lot of women wouldn't have been able to read the text, right? That were in the church. So does that make the image kind of more impactful in this sense? Because if they can't read the text itself, this is the way that they can at least, as
They
you
would have
said,
heard it though. They would have most likely
Yeah.
been familiar with the narrative story, whether they read it themselves, which lay people, it'd be probably unproblematic. They're probably not having read text directly themselves. They certainly would have heard it read aloud.
right?
So they would have been aware of it in that respect. But the visual narrative would have been, as you know, even Pope Gregory says, the visual narrative is there in place of the text, so that those who are illiterate can read, so to speak.
Yeah, great, thanks. I have a couple questions on Zoom if I can jump in. So Jessica Ziakin-Cook is online and she's asking, thank you, Nicola, for sharing your wonderful work and teaching. I'm reading a lot about visual theology and would love to hear more about visual rhetoric and graphic exegesis. As a comment on the growing field, could you speak to the methodologies in the history of art and Christianity?
That's a huge question. Well, one of the persons who's sort of influential for mine is both Nygren and Richard Brilliant, but Nygren in particular, who does try to move retrography sort of more into its own field, where images are now proffering their own exegesis, right? Where images, because before historically it's being the text, which is being the main source of information historically, right? Where more the image serves the text, sort of buffers up its historical account, where retrography and exegesis, even ekphrasis now, is looking more at the role of the image directly as a form of biblical interpretation, sort of almost free from the text, or as a primary source with its own reading of that text. But it itself would be the primary source as opposed to the narrative, the literary narrative. But other than that, it's a huge question.
Okay, I'm going to ask another one before we go back to the room. Brian Pollock has a question. Thank you for a fascinating talk, Nicola. My question is whether you think there was anything in the theological/doctrinal differences between the Arian and Orthodox rites that would have affected female viewer experience, depending on which rite they belong to.
Well, as Taff says, there's not really a set Byzantine liturgy at this time. And even though Theodoric was actually Arian, these images, we just simply don't know if they were Arian. What does an Arian image look like? Or even what does an Arian liturgy work like? There's nothing specifically set at that time. So it's really, truth be told, it's an impossible question to answer because we simply just don't know entirely. What is a Eastern Orthodox? What is a Western Orthodox literary system? What is Eastern art and what is Western art? And they tend to meld quite a bit, particularly in this church, because Constantinople did have a big influence at that time on Ravenna.
Thanks, Nicola. This is sort of a left field question because as you were naming the four texts and the images that you've been studying, another gospel text that came to my mind was the lost drachma. And I'm wondering whether there are other texts that are omitted of women in the Gospels that are omitted or at least from what we've heard, aren't there?
Oh, potentially. Absolutely. I mean, that's the interesting thing about images is really the interpretations open up to the viewer. I mean, maybe a woman did read that particular account and that's what she would have seen in that particular image. But the images are not set in a where they have to be read in a specific way always. So they are left up to a certain degree to the viewer. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
I guess because I had myself an epiphanic experience seeing, because I had never seen, frankly, I'd never seen an image of that particular gospel text before, and it follows immediately on the Good Shepherd. And so in a sense, they are kind of parallels for the kind of care of God for God's creation. And I had never seen an image. I mean, you see lots of, right, the Good Shepherd, but I'd never seen an image of the woman finding the lost drachma.
Neither have I, and I would love to actually see that. If you could show it to me, that'd be wonderful. I have not either.
All right.
There's another question from Laura Duhan Kaplan. Laura's asking, she loves the idea of kind of the divine giving meaning to the world through color. So wondering if you can say any more about the theology of art.
Well, the idea is that color, rather than line and shading, which we understand is sort of that idea of form and meaning, for antiquity, and I'm following Liz James on this, is that color is one that gives reality and truth to these images. And again, it's also following this idea which Gregory talks about, which God painted humans in color in that way, giving form and life and meaning to these images. So it's the color and the way it works within the space, within the light, which I didn't really dare get directly to in this situation, where the color and the light create this brilliance and illumination, creating this sort of more theological idea, this sort of divine space. But they work, the light and the color work in tandem together.
Is there any extent description of why the procession of female martyrs, like its choice for the space and place and how it was interpreted at that time?
I didn't touch the female martyrs for this particular paper, or yet anyways. I have yet to decide whether or not I want to bring the female martyrs into the discussion. And I might have to, but I have not as of yet delved into that part of that research for the female martyrs yet.
And do we know anything about the artists who
No,
do
there's multiple artists are involved, some from the West, some from the East, but in antiquity, you just don't know their names of the artists. We do, so you know in the Renaissance, you know Bernini, you know Michelangelo, you know Caravaggio, but you don't know the name of the artists who create these mosaics at all that I'm aware of, unless anybody else happens to, but I don't know of any names that actually have ever been mentioned. There'd be few people. I mean, the work is so intricate. You have to imagine you're up high, you've got tiny little tessera of glass that you then got to put in place. You have to make sure you've got the scale and the rendering up. And that's hard to do when you're up close and personal to these as well, and at that height. It's not an easy work to do for sure.
Got time for maybe one more question, Mohammed,
Well, this was something-
unless someone else wants to go.
Well, this is more of an art question, because as a ceramicist, what kind of clay and what glazes are used? It's beautiful. The glazes are beautiful.
And I have absolutely no clue. No clue. Unless somebody else who's familiar, I don't know the glaze that they use. It's usually it can be stone, but it's usually glass tessera because it just sparkles well. But glass is also very expensive. Oh, there you go. They don't have a glaze. They don't have a glaze. Glass, yeah, yeah.
And
Yeah,
do they
and it
make
just
them
sparkles.
up there, or do they make them on the ground and then move them up?
I would have,
know that?
I don't even know that. I would assume they might have to, I mean, going up there and cutting them precisely, that maybe minor adjustments, I'm assuming, most likely when they're positioned that high up. But I can't imagine they'd be taking larger pieces and fitting them, maybe minor
know the
adjustments
answer to
later.
that?
Yeah,
No.
yeah, on the wall, yeah.
So there's an artist who creates the
Mhm.
picture.
Hmm.
I'm pretty sure the guy standing on the ladder is doing what he's told to do.
Yeah, that might very much be the case.
Maybe the tradesman, not the
Yeah.
artist.
Right.
Right, yes,
Right.
and that would make much more sense, because you'd need somebody from a distance of the visual to get the understanding of where to place it too. You'd have no idea. Yeah, exactly, which would be impossible that close up, which makes much more sense. Yeah, thank you.
All right, well, we're just about at the end of our time, so let's have a round of applause for Nicola. Thanks very much for that beautiful presentation.